not on the average citizen to understand something as abstract as cybersecurity.
So let me ask you then, can you have, because many times people confuse data governance with governance of a company that has a lot of technology. So can you have appropriate data governance if you don't have someone that's specialized, such as a council or a committee or an ethics consultant? I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit, but I think there are several opinions that we see. Some companies say, you know what, we can never know all the intricacies and nuances, and we need a specialized team that will handle this. Or others say, no, please teach us, we can handle it by ourselves, and then we can just sustain. So can I hear your thoughts on that?
So I'm not sure, is the contrast between having a sort of specialized team?
Correct. Like, do you need an ethics counselor or an ethics committee or an ethics council in companies that have a lot of data that they share or use, and are at risk, right? So let's say we do a risk analysis in a company and we identify that they are at high risk. They agree they're at high risk and they want to do good. We assume they want to do good.
Yeah.
Should they have someone specialized, or can they really do something on their own?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that they need some sort of a specialist in the area. As I said earlier, if you want ethical leadership, then you need to have someone who's deeply familiar with the relevant concepts, the literature, the case studies, et cetera. Otherwise, you're going to try to reinvent the wheel and you're not going to do a very good job, right? So I do think that you need specialists at play. I do think something like an ethics committee is very important. It need not be a self-standing ethics committee. It could be a committee that is already existing that deals with certain kinds of, say, corporate risks. And it takes on the additional responsibility of dealing with certain kinds of ethical risks. And then, of course, there's a big question about where does the committee sit within the organization?
Exactly. How can they be how can they avoid bias, right? Because if they're part of the organization, they can be highly trained, but they'll be embedded in the ROI processes and the pressures of engaging with stakeholders, and then it can get blurry, right? So
yeah. I mean, that's why it's highly recommended that you have external ethics advisors who know the field and who are impartial and who aren't trying to get raises and promotions. I think aligning financial incentives is really important. Just the very last thing is, you want to think also about the jurisdiction of that committee. What are the kinds of things that they're going to consider? What are the processes by which other people within the organization raise issues to those committees? And then the big thing is, what are the powers of the committees, right? Is it just an advisory role to, say, a CIO or a chief analytics officer? Or to the CEO? Do they have the power to stop projects in their tracks? Do they have the power to tell product developers that, you need to change X, Y, and Z, or we're not going to greenlight this project and it has to stop there? If you don't get clear on what the powers are, then an ethics committee is not going to actually do anything. It has to have some kind of teeth.
Yeah, I did, but I'll just, I'm a bit like a cracked record. That's why I think the board and the CEO need to lead this, and the committee can feed information to the board and the CEO, but they need to make those decisions. I wanted also just to quickly come back, and I understand fully why you're saying you hope it's not necessary for this mass education of the population about their data and so forth. The one thing I do think, though, that people would like to know and would need to know is if they want to stop the continued use and sale of their personal data, how they do it. And then the final point that I wanted to make, which we haven't really talked about yet, to your point, Reid, if we say, okay, it's up to the corporations, do we trust in the benevolent tendencies of the organisations that they will do that? Or is this somewhere where we really need to think some more about regulation? And then what would that regulation look like, and how would the regulators work on issues like that?
Exactly. So that brings us back to the regulatory frameworks and the public policies. So should we have a little bit more strict guidance on this? Reid,
I was reading recently, and this is just an initiative with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, who were looking around ethics and fintech and the financial system. And they've launched something called Fairness, Ethics, Accountability and Transparency Principles for the use of AI and data analytics in decision making. And they're essentially doing this as a high-level principle-based approach in collaboration with the big banks and the fintechs and the tech giants and the regulator to really try and work through some of this. So I just thought that that was an interesting approach that's been taken in Singapore that might be a basis for some further conversation about how you regulate, because, you know, I think right across a lot of digital data, fintech, blockchain, the regulators are really struggling to know what to do and how to address it. And some kind of collaborative government industry approach with some principles is one way of putting it on the table.
Mm-hmm. Reid, any thoughts? We're all three involved in a lot of frameworks and guidelines, so we can comment on all the good things that can go in it, and then I'll bring up some of the problems we have. So Reid, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so let's see, lots to say. So look, yeah, some kind of framework is a good starting point. Okay, so I should say earlier, what you said about earlier, Jane, no, we should not rely on the benevolence of corporations. I think right now there's an extent to which they are active, and that's not driven by benevolence, but by self-interest, reasonable, justified self-interest, which is to say, we don't want the reputational harms to our brand when we are in the news or go viral for all the wrong reasons, being investigated by regulators and so on. There's loads of cases of companies being sued, investigated by regulators, and suffering reputational harms from the improper stewardship of data or the creation of privacy violating, biased, unexplainable machine learning algorithms. So that's what the primary motivation is now. I don't think it's sufficient to get us to where we need to be, or at least not fast enough. So yeah, I do think that we need some kind of regulation. I'm not convinced that very high level ethical principles are the way to go. And the reason for that is the way that you get agreement on widespread principles is by watering them down so much that they don't actually point in any particular direction. So for instance, when you talk about AI ethics, people like to talk about fairness and then proudly proclaim that they're for fairness. But that is so watered down that it's something that the KKK could get behind. The KKK could say, we're for fairness. Now, they have a very different conception, not to mention a misguided one about what that actually looks like, how, you know, what direction that points us in, as it were. But nonetheless, they could still, in principle, in the abstract, affirm the principle of fairness. So, you know, the principles don't mean anything unless they're connected in they have to rule certain things out substantively. And if they don't do that, then they're just useless. And all they do is create a thin veneer of agreement or the appearance of agreement, when in fact there's a ton of disagreement underneath that garb.
I would push it even further. I wanted to mention when you both brought up the issue of compliance, to not confuse ethics with compliance. And I think, yes, unfortunately, a lot of the frameworks are great to just highlight what you shouldn't do, which is sometimes fairly obvious already to organizations that intend to do well. But then they don't tell you what to do. They all say, okay, this sounds beautiful. I love that 87 or 130 page report, but what do I do tomorrow morning at 7 if I want to do something better in my organization? So maybe we can spend a few minutes also on, if I'm the CEO of a company and I'm only well-intended and I know a little bit about ethics and I will fully support you and I will make my team available. Reid, maybe you can break it down for us. And I know you recently wrote an article about how can we actually build a proactive ethics program that will be meaningful and implementable, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that there's an extent to which obviously you need that sort of senior leadership. You need some kind of board, like an ethics committee to which issues go. But it's extremely important to sort of get into the details a bit. What are the role-specific responsibilities that are necessary? So, you know, when we're talking about, say, product development and deployment, we're talking about data collectors, product developers, product managers, product owners. They all have different, obviously, roles to play within the life cycle of product development. And they need to have certain kinds of conversations with each other, and they each need to have certain kinds of or sets of responsibilities in order for the ultimate values of the organization to be lived up to. So what a CEO needs to do is make sure that there's that level of detail to the ethics program. If it's just, as you said, a 145-page document, or it's just buried in some policy books, it's not going to mean anything. It has to be, what are the role-specific responsibilities various people have? And as I said before, how do our financial incentives line up with what we expect of them? Are we incentivizing them to do these things? At the very least, are we removing any disincentives from doing those things? Because my sense is that a lot of engineers, especially, they want to take this stuff really seriously, but if they don't have the organizational support to do it, which includes doing it is taken into account when it comes to time for promotion, bonuses, et cetera, then they're not going to sacrifice their careers for it, reasonably enough.
I'd like to add just another, practical example from my experience. Some time ago, when I was the CEO of a company, we were very clear on what our ethics were as a company, and we ran an ethics in action series, if you like. And this is engaging different groups in the organization and really sitting down together and talking about each ethical principle. Let's say it's like fairness. And then you say, what does fairness mean? And get some kind of shared understanding about that. And then what does it mean that you do in the workplace or in your work? And what do you not do? So really broke it down to that level where people started to be able to, give it the granularity read that you were talking about. And in my experience, it was that discussion and debate. And this was a public health company, and this was at the time of the HIV epidemic, and talking about some of those really ethical laden, value laden decisions that you might make about privacy with HIV patients. And it was only through having those kinds of debates and really exploring with the teams, what you might and might not do and where those kind of value judgments came, that we were able to kind of imbue that kind of ethical thinking throughout the organization. So it's not just create the rules, it's also about engage people in the discussion.
Exactly. So what you're describing is the culture of ethics that we always talk about. Right? I like to say it's so hard to build that culture of ethics, right? And it has to have everybody participate and engage, otherwise you can't sustain it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're 100% right. As I conceive of the role of various role responsibilities, I take among the set of those responsibilities is to have those kinds of conversations. So if you're, say, building machine learning model and you're worried about bias, you might think about, okay, if we're worried about bias in this way and that way, what would a potentially problematic data set look like? Let's talk about that with the data collectors and to have a conversation with them about what we need our data sets to look like if we're going to have all else equal unbiased outputs, right? And that's a qualitative conversation. Contrary to what's going on in some of the computer science literature on this, there's not just some simple mathematical definition of fairness that you can slap on and solve the problem. So these kinds of conversations, you're right, are absolutely essential.
So what are some kind of questions that organizations can use to prompt and engage their employees to do kind of an ongoing risk assessment and ongoing understanding of where the culture of ethics barometer is, so to speak, in the organization? Can you both comment? Maybe Reed first and then Jane. What are some helpful talks or conversations they can have to make sure they keep a pulse on what's going on? Because many times, as we know, the way I've seen organizations, they schedule a quarterly review or an annual review, and that doesn't work for ethics, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, first of all, to do is figure out what's your, what are the goals that you're trying to achieve, or at least what are the nightmares you're trying to avoid. Because what you're at risk for is going to be relative to what you really want to avoid, right? So if you're really scared about, say, creating an AI that discriminates against Black people when it determines who's worthy of a loan, then you're going to ask questions about bias mitigation. So you might go to your product owners and say, hey, what processes do we have in place to systematically and exhaustively vet for biased algorithms? And if the answer is, well, we don't really have any, then that's a red flag, right? If you say, hey, listen, are any of our, if explainability is really important, either for regulatory reasons or ethical reasons or both, you might say, what kinds of processes do we have or for determining when an algorithm needs to be explainable versus when it doesn't have to be? So for instance, because one issue was that sometimes you